Well, welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. This is our first meeting of the 2020, what year is it? 2021, 22 academic year. The Socratic Club has been in existence on the Gonzaga campus now. I think this is year 18. The Socratic Club, I'm sorry, is weirdly named. It's not a club. You don't have to join. We borrowed the name from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was started in the mid-1900s on the Oxford University campus. And it was founded as a place, especially where people of wildly differing beliefs could get together and talk especially, welcome, please come on in, and talk especially about issues having to do with religion, philosophy, and how religion and philosophy and all those related disciplines kind of intersect one another. The most famous participant, at least to people outside of the academy, there are a lot of very famous scholars and academics that attended and presented at the Oxford Socratic Club. The most famous person to people outside the university was C.S. Lewis, who was the president of the club during the 40s and into the early 50s. So we take our name from the Oxford Socratic Club, and like the Oxford Socratic Club, we follow the motto to follow the truth wherever, follow the argument or the truth wherever it leads, especially concerning matters of Christian worldview. So we are very much in a good place to have my colleague, Dr. Doug Kries, here to present for us today on, we talked a lot about the title, because if you notice, it has a super long, this is like it's kind of like a 17th century title, but you're going to range from the 15th or 16th all the way to the 18th or somewhere around there. But anyway, there was a period, especially in the 17th and 18th century, where you often had a subtitle that was a page long, and he's tried to capture that feel here. But he's going to talk about the relationship between the religious authority and the secular authority, or we might say, to shorthand that, church and state, and their competing authorities and how we think about that resolution. So if you would, welcome my colleague, Dr. Kries, and we will get started.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Last year, while most of you were struggling with Zoom meetings, online classes, and hybrid teaching, I was blessed with being on sabbatical. Concretely, what this meant is that I incurred the envy and the enmity of my colleagues and students while I mostly sat at home at my desk writing a monograph on the political thought of Robert Bellarmine. Life can be so unfair. In the spirit of reconciliation, I volunteered to share for the Socratic Club a few of my thoughts about Cardinal Bellarmine, who died exactly 400 years ago last Friday, September 17th. Bellarmine was the spiritual advisor of our own Aloysius Gonzaga, who had only recently finished his philosophy studies at a Jesuit university when he died exactly 430 years ago, this past June 21st. Today, just to finish the story, today the remains of both Bellarmine and Luigi, as Aloysius was commonly called, rest next to each other at individual memorial altars in the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome. If you go, the urn of Aloysius Gonzaga is the blue one, which surely explains, don't you think, why our school color is blue? I think that must be the case. If it doesn't, it should. Bellarmine is most famous for writing an enormous work titled Disputations on the Controversies of the Christian Faith against the Heretics of Our Time. These started as teaching lectures, but grew to include 4 very thick volumes. By the heretics, Bellarmine meant, of course, the Protestants. For their part, the Protestants admitted that Bellarmine always fairly reconstructed their arguments. Philosophy 101 students take heed. Sometimes even explaining them better than they were able to explain them themselves. These were their own words. This was, of course, before he proceeded to attack their arguments. So powerful were Bellarmine's attacks that soon faculty chairs were established at Cambridge and other Protestant universities with the express and sole intention of answering the controversies. Although the controversies covered enormous ground, it was a rather small passage on the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority, or church and state, as we might put it now, that proved to be the most controversial of the controversies. My goal this afternoon is to explain not the arguments between Bellarmine and Protestants, however, but between Bellarmine on one hand and the famous philosophers Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the other. I will not pursue this dispute about church and state in the standard way of marshalling written texts supporting my interpretation of it. We are, after all, at the end of Monday afternoon, right? But rather, I will attempt to explain the whole issue through the use of artwork. My hope is to challenge us to reflect carefully about the criticisms of Christianity leveled by these two profound political philosophers. Okay, so a brief introduction explaining the problem. Then we'll look at an etching from Hobbes's Leviathan. From Rousseau, we'll look or listen very briefly to an opera. Don't worry, not the whole thing. And then conclude with an etching of Rousseau's. And then I'll try to pose the question for us again. So, go ahead and this slide. Okay.
I may have to click on the window, Doug. I'm sorry. I hope it's working right. There now, yeah. Your arrow should work now.
Okay, so perhaps we can clarify a little bit by way of contrast. Judaism and Islam both seem to be complete ways of life. That is to say, they have lots of laws and rules. And if you want to know how to be Jewish or Islamic, and you want to have an Islamic or Jewish regime, it seems that you could do that. The Torah has the Mishnah, so 613 commandments in the Torah. You add the commentary on that, and you would seem to be able to have a regime. And in fact, there once was a Jewish regime. The famous Sharia law has its own set of jurisprudence called fiqh, actually different schools and so forth. And so it prescribes a complete way of life, of politics, including temporal politics, including how to set up a regime. Christianity seems to be the odd one out here. Christianity developed an ecclesiastical law, it's sometimes called canon law, but it never has had the status of Torah or Sharia in Judaism or Islam. And it doesn't extend to the whole of life. It doesn't extend to political regimes, for example. Now, if you don't want to take my word for these rather grandiose claims, you can listen to or look at this quick quote from Tocqueville, who says, quote, Muhammad had not only religious doctrines descend from heaven and placed in the Quran, but political maxims, civil and criminal laws, scientific theories. The Gospels, in contrast, speak only of the general relations of men to God and among themselves, only general relations. Now, okay, so what is Christianity going to have to do to try to get a grip on this question of spiritual and temporal authority? Well, the main text,
The principal text that is always cited in these arguments is Matthew 22. Then he, Jesus, said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Which seems to imply, or at least has been interpreted as applying, that there's a distinction between the temporal and the spiritual. Two other texts that are important always in these controversies are Romans 13, the beginning of the chapter. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Okay, now that seems to be a pretty strong statement in favor of doing what the governors say, but we have to put that against Acts 5. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Okay, so the task for Bellarmine or any Christian thinking about these problems is to make these texts consistent with each other. How would they be qualified? What other statements would we have to include to make all of this work systematic? Well, Bellarmine didn't think that he had actually said anything novel, but he became famous for what's called, even today, the theory of the indirect power of the spiritual authority in temporal affairs. It's really a very simple theory, this little part of the controversies. Statement 1, the difference between spiritual and temporal authority means that normally the two authorities are distinct. Matthew 22, okay? They're usually distinct. 2, the end or goal of spiritual authority is higher than the end of temporal authority. So notice he thinks in terms of ends or goals. It's pure Aristotle. Think in terms of the telos, the goal toward which one is heading. 3, hence, sometimes the spiritual authority can exercise temporal authority, especially if the temporal authority interferes with the spiritual authority attaining its proper end. Okay, so normally everybody gets along fine, but if the temporal authority intervenes into spiritual affairs, then the spiritual authority can do something temporally about it. This is the potestas indirecta of Robert Bellarmine. Incidentally, Truth in Advertising. This is the only lifelike statue that I have in the program. This is Bellarmine, and it is it strikes me as a lifelike statue. It just looks like he's about to say something. This was done by Bernini, Gian Bernini, the man who did the colonnade, all the columns at St. Peter's in Rome. Same guy. This was early in his career. Okay. Now, so that's what Bellarmine thought. One of the chief critics of Bellarmine was Thomas Hobbes. The single longest chapter of his famous book, Leviathan, is a point-by-point attempted refutation of Robert Bellarmine. Goes on and on and on. Hobbes took Bellarmine very, very seriously. Now, this is not from chapter 42, but 39. And this kind of summarizes Hobbes' points. Temporal and spiritual government are but two words brought into the world to make men see double and mistake their lawful sovereign. Okay, Hobbes is for the unity of temporal and spiritual authority. And this whole idea of two different, well, it makes people see double. And then they don't know whom to obey. It's a big mess. It is true that the bodies of the faithful after the resurrection shall be not only spiritual, but eternal. But in this life, they are gross and corruptible. There is, therefore, no other government in this life, neither of state nor religion, but temporal. nor teaching of any doctrine, lawful to any subject, which the governor, both of the state and of the religion, forbiddeth to be taught, and that governor must be one. The sovereign must always be one, or else there must needs follow faction, civil war in the commonwealth, between the church and the state, between spiritualists and temporalists, between the sword of justice and the shield of faith, and which is more, this is very interesting to me, in every Christian man's own breast, between the Christian and the man. It's not only external, but internal tensions as a result of Christianity. That's Hobbes's objection in a nutshell. Now, I wanted, so much for introduction to the basic problem. Now I want to talk about this famous engraving. Those of us who are of a certain age will probably, we cut our teeth in Hobbes's Leviathan from the Pelican Classics. Michael, you know it, you have it. I don't think it's used as much as it once was. Now we use Hackett Press's edition. But this, it's an engraving and it's everywhere if you study Hobbes. It's printed and reprinted over and over again. Okay, for the presentation, I was able to download this from the British Museum. They're very generous. It turns out to be a very nice copy of the engraving. What is this? This is an etching for the frontispiece. So at the very beginning of the book, they would include a picture. And of course, they didn't have photography, so they used an engraving. This is the one that was used for Leviathan, Hobbes's most famous book, published first in 1651. Now, it's such a, usually it's this top half that people are most interested in. And there's a reason for that, as I'll show you some things about it. But notice Hobbes's basic objection. Here we have a sword representing temporal authority. Here we have the pastor's crook, the crozier, representing spiritual authority. They're both being held by the sovereign, okay, this artificial person made up of the wills of all of the people through a sort of social contract. And notice that the lines projected on out of the two cross directly over the head of the sovereign. The unity of church and state, religion and politics in the sovereign. It's published, Leviathan, or the matter, form and power of the commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil, by Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury. And it was printed in London. It was printed for Andrew Cook in 1651. Okay, now, so that's the frontispiece, the picture, the engraving. Then if you turn to the next page, you have the title page. And so this is just a photograph I took with my phone of I guess it's plagiarism, of the title page of the first printing of the first edition of Leviathan. Okay, now, after the book was first published, the authorities didn't appreciate it, and there were attempts to suppress it. They didn't go after it in a big way, but they did say no more publishing of the book. So there were 3 printings of the book in the 17th century. They just kept using the etching over and over again, but they changed the title page ever so slightly. Here's the first title page. Okay, it's got this doodad here. We'll use the technical language. Okay, here we hone in on it, and you can see in the middle there's a little head. So this comes to be called the head printing, or the head edition of the book. Okay, then when they wanted to do it again, the only thing they changed was the decoration, the doodad. This is, I guess, a little bear. You can't see it too well, but here's a detail of the Bear edition. And notice that they're still claiming it's printed for Andrew Cook at the Green Dragon door at St. Paul's Churchyard, 1651. And then the third edition, okay, or the third printing, I should say, it's the same edition. Third time the etching was printed. This time they've changed this to these little, I don't know what you would call them. They're referred to simply as ornaments. And if you count them up, there are 25 ornaments. Okay, so we have the head, the bear, the 25 ornaments. It's the only way you can tell these first editions apart. Okay, and you're thinking, well, that's nice, Mr. Kries, but I want zippy music. And so what does this have to do with it? Well, when you're on sabbatical, you have a lot of time to do things that you don't normally do. So I'm writing this book on Bellarmine, and of course, there's got to be a substantial chapter on Bellarmine versus Hobbes. Okay, so I just start going through the whole of the Hobbes holdings at a fully centered library. This one's curious. That came up, obviously, Leviathan. You know, that's not too unique. Hobbes, here his dates, 1588. 1651, well, that's probably they're just referring to the publication of the first edition. It's not really that old, but it's up in the third floor special collection. So because you're on sabbatical and you have extra time, call my friend Dave Kingma, who's the special collections librarian. I thought I'd go up there. What I thought what I'd get is a facsimile of an early edition of Leviathan. You know, they take a photograph of the pages, and then this was before they had Google Books, you know, to do that. But then David goes back in the vault and he brings out this. That is definitely an old book, or at least a beat up book, to be sure. And I thought, well, what is this? So I opened the cover. Boom, there's the etching. Right there, this is the whole thing is right there. And so I realized, oh, this is one of the 17th century printings, the first printings of Leviathan. Now, little internal quiz. Okay, so because what am I thinking next? Let's see. Well, is it head, bear, or 25 ornaments? Okay, so I turn to the title page, and it's 25 ornaments. Okay, so Gonzaga has so it's not as cool as having a head edition. You know, that would really be something, but 25 ornaments, they're listed at a couple places on the internet. Book dealers are offering them at $4,800 a piece, so it's worth something looking at. Okay, well, thank you for indulging me on that. I find that fast. I was very proud of myself for finding that book. Okay, now I got something else to show you about this strange etching. Okay, this is the original, okay, that we've seen. This is a fair copy pencil drawing of the etching. In other words, it's not printed. It's drawn with the pencil. Okay. Well, who cares? Why does this matter? Well, this is the copy. Excuse me. This is the frontispiece of the copy that Hobbes presented to King Charles II. Okay, he offered it to. Basically, the court told him to get lost and never come back. They didn't care for Hobbes at all, but that's what this is. Now, okay, they look identical, but okay, here's the etching, a detail from 1651, the published etching. Okay, and if you look at it, see, all of these people have their backs turned to you. They are wearing these hats, most of them, and they're all streaming toward the sovereign here. Okay, now that's the printed version. This is the presentation copy drawing. And notice the heads are turned around. We have all these frankly, kind of ugly, bulbous cancers growing on the sovereign. Okay, but we see the faces of all these people. Now, I mean, okay, that Mr. Kries is interested in strange things, but what's the point here? Okay, there was a fellow named Niceron. He lived in the Maxim convent in Paris. One of the main luminaries of the Maxim convent was Father Mersenne, who we know is the great friend of Descartes. But Hobbes was also living in Paris at this time, and Hobbes knew Mersenne and through him met Niceron. And Niceron had done a drawing of, this is called anamorphic art. And it's a strange thing, okay? But the way it works is, so Niceron made this, it's a painting. This is just a drawing from Niceron's book, but he made a painting of these many heads. Then he made this wooden tube, kind of like a telescope thing. And in the tube, we have this refracted glass to serve as lenses. Okay, so when you look through the tube, you didn't see this, you saw this. Okay, an image of Louis XIII, a painting of Louis XIII. These are all sultans who came to do homage to Louis. And then this is Louis. Sometimes, at one time, they did this with the prophets. They had the prophets here, and then you look through the tube, and you saw an image of Christ there. Okay, from many, you come to one. Okay, well, Hobbes saw this. He knew Niceron. This is a book from 1638. Okay, Hobbes saw this, and that seems to be where he got the idea for his engraving. So from there, you would go to, see, we're back with many heads coming together to form the one sovereign. That seemed to have been ugly. So the artist, who knew Hobbes worked with the artist, okay, then turned it around so it looks a little more pleasing in the end. Okay, so I've been talking about the top of the engraving. Now I want to talk about the bottom. 3 panels. This is the title panel. This panel under the sword has to do with temporal affairs. This under the crozier has to do with spiritual affairs. We'll zoom in on it a little bit, okay? Now, so here we have a castle, okay, for temporal affairs. Here we have the church, spiritual. The crown versus the bishop's mitre, okay? Then the canon over here, and the correlate, the spiritual correlate to the temporal canon is this. Hobbes uses the phrase in the book, the thunderbolt of excommunication. So this is thought to be the thunderbolt of excommunication. Then, well, we'll talk about these some more, but here we have the paraphernalia of war. Drums, flags, pikes, and, well, guns here. Over here we have the paraphernalia of the spiritual, which we're going to talk about more carefully. Here we have an actual temporal battle among the politicians, the political types, a military battle. Here we have, well, it looks to be, frankly, a meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. But I think this is actually meant to be a meeting of the Inquisition. Actually, the people are in these robes and they're wearing the beretta, the common cap worn by clerics at the time. And Bellarmine was very much a part of the Inquisition. It could also be the index of forbidden books that's being debated here. So you have each side See, they're arguing back and forth in a debate, and these are the judges listening in, the presiding officer, possibly the Pope here. What I really want to show you is this pen, the only one that has writing on it. We read from front to back. Okay, here we have literally the horns of a dilemma. Okay, so that's remember, this corresponds to the weapons, the tools, the paraphernalia of the military. Okay, so dilemmas, that's what those are about. Then in the second row, we have these three strange pitchforks with 2 points, 2 points. This one was 3 points, a trident. This one says syllogism. Okay, syllogism. Why does it have 3 points? Well, I think it's because in a syllogism, as you all know, you usually have major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Okay, first premise, second premise, conclusion. I think that's what that's about. Over here, we have this says real and intentional. So there are real distinctions, distinctions that have a basis in the world, and then intentional distinctions, distinctions that come from us. Okay, and I think that's what that's about. And then we have, and here it is, front and center, the distinction between spiritual and temporal. Now, but that pitchfork is the only one that has a pitchfork behind it. And what does that say? Oh, direct and indirect. Well, that's Bellarmine, right? The indirect theory, the theory of the indirect power of the spiritual authority over the temporal, if the temporal interferes with the spiritual. Notice too, it's a nice little final touch we'll just mention. See, all of the points are straight, except this one for the indirect, which curves. And it's about to curve around, and it's going to intersect with the trajectory of the direct. That was Bellarmine's, one of his fundamental points, Hobbes's fundamental points against Bellarmine, is that the indirect authority ultimately turned into a direct authority anyway. So he didn't think there was really any distinction between them in the end. Okay. Now, Hobbes is, that's probably the most famous engraving that any philosophy book ever got, was the one Hobbes's Leviathan got. But we got to move on to say a little something about Rousseau. Here's, I titled it The Objection of Rousseau to Hobbes. This is from On the Social Contract. Rousseau says, of all Christian authors, the philosopher Hobbes is the only one who correctly saw the evil and the remedy, who dared to propose the reunification of the two heads of the eagle. So the eagle represents the empire with its spiritual and temporal head, and they have to be reunified somehow. Hobbes saw that, Rousseau says. Okay, Rousseau's a big reader of Hobbes. And the complete return to political unity, without which no state or government will ever be well constituted. But he ought to have seen that the dominating spirit of Christianity was incompatible with his system, and that the interest of the priest would always be stronger than that of the state. And then this is a typical cryptic Rousseau remark. It is not so much what is horrible and false in his politics as what is correct and true that has made it odious. Hobbes was, rejected by decent people everywhere. He was from Malmesbury, came to be known as the monster of Malmesbury. But Rousseau says, yeah, what made him odious is what he had correct, i.e., the reunification of church and state that seems to be endemic, the separation of which seems to be endemic to Christianity. Okay, well, if Hobbes's solution wasn't sufficient, according to Rousseau, then what was? So it's my interpretation of Rousseau. I think this is very defensible. That what he wants to reintegrate the spiritual with the temporal, right? Well, what is that going to give us? A kind of pantheism, right? That's what he wants, is a turn to something like that. A religion of nature, a fertility religion, emphasizing family and fecundity and reproduction. Rousseau is also all about sentiment, passions, feelings, affections, okay, rather than thinking. And so he's going to want a religion that emphasizes those things. Okay, we could call it the religion of romanticism. Rousseau is sometimes viewed as the first romantic. Okay, so Rousseau in 1751 published an essay that made him famous overnight. He was this obscure musicologist who was kind of an on-hanger to the Enlightenment luminaries, wandering around Paris, trying to make a way of life for himself. And suddenly he publishes this essay in response to an advertisement for an essay competition held by the Academy of Dijon. And he wins the competition. And not only that, but then see the essay is published. And Rousseau is suddenly the toast of Europe. Okay, well, when you're on a roll, you're on a roll. So he turned around and brought out, he had already started this, but he started this project of an opera called The Village Soothsayer. And he managed to get it performed at the King's Castle at Fontainebleau on, we even know the date, October 18th, 1752. And we even know the names of the actors, so we have the bill of it. It was called The Village Soothsayer. Rousseau wrote not only the music, but also the libretto for the opera, the little booklet that tells about the story of the opera. Now, what is this opera about? It too became a smashing hit. It was not only done at Fontainebleau, but then at the Royal Theatre in Paris. It was performed again at the marriage of Marie Antoinette. Okay? It was a big deal. The king loved it. He was going around humming it all the time. So much so that he offered Rousseau a stipend if he just, all Rousseau had to do was live at the court, okay, leech off the court, basically. The play is about, Colin, and Colette. And it seems that, alas, Colette has lost her beau, Colin, because Colin sees a simple pastoral sort, a rustic, close to nature. See, works in the fields. He's a simple guy, but alas, he seems to have fallen for the daughter of the local lord, okay, in the manor house. And Colette is distraught, but then soon she seems to be forming an attachment with a young man from the court. Okay, so you see here, this is pure Rousseau. We have the rust, we have the emphasis upon fertility, fecundity, religion of nature, okay, where everybody's getting along. And on the other hand, you have civilization, evil civilization, which the sophisticated types who would corrupt simple human nature even farther than it's already been corrupted. Well, what happens is that the village soothsayer, Colette, makes a little visit to him. And he, he knows the ways of nature, so there's a potion that he makes. And he arranges all of these things so that pretty soon, Colin and Colette are back together and they live happily ever after, or so we're given to understand. Now, I'm just going to play a few 2 minutes of the overture of the opera. You'll notice I described it as zippy. The ancients were all about the mathematics of music. Rousseau couldn't really care less. For him, music was about emotion, affection, melody. He wanted something you could hum, something you could whistle, song, that sort of thing. Okay, so the overture of the village soothsayer. I got this off the internet. Okay, so I mentioned that the king had offered Rousseau the possibility of living at court on the dole of the state, as it were. Rousseau promptly said to the poor king, thanks, but no thanks. And he went off to live in a little cottage in the woods by himself. Okay, he wasn't going to get, the whole point of the opera is for simple rustic folk not to get corrupted by those evil, civilized, sophisticated types. So Rousseau took his own opera to heart, I guess, and went off to live in the woods. And he began to research and write. He began to research and write on his second discourse on the origins of inequality. Now, this is the frontispiece of that book, published, I think it was 1754, so 2 years later after the opera. This is actually from a footnote, and it's not actually, the footnote are not Rousseau's words. He's quoting a man named Colbane, and Colbane has heard this story, and he's reported it. And Rousseau liked it, and so he included it in his footnote, and then also in the etching that formed the frontispiece for the book. Rousseau too cared about this. He was apprenticed to an engraver at age 10. So he says he likes this in a letter. He says he likes this engraving very much. Here's the story as it was reported. Quote, all the efforts of the Dutch missionaries at the Cape of Good Hope have never been able to convert a single Hottentot. The Hottentots were the local peoples at the Cape of Good Hope, the savages. So the wild people. Rousseau called these people savages, but it just means wild in French. It's not a term of opprobrium. Van der Stel, the Dutch governor of the Cape, having taken one from infancy, had him raised in the principles of the Christian religion and in the practice of European customs. He was richly dressed, he was taught several languages, and his progress corresponded very well to the cares taken for his education. The governor placed great hopes in his intelligence, sent him to the Indies with a general commissioner who employed him usefully in the affairs of the company. He returned to the Cape after the death of the commissioner. A few days after his return, during a visit he paid to some of his Hottentot relatives, he made the decision to divest himself of his European finery in order to clothe himself in a sheepskin. He returned to the fort in this new garb, carrying a package which contained his old clothes. And presenting them to the governor, he made this speech. Be so kind, sir, as to understand that I renounce this paraphernalia forever. I renounce also for my entire life the Christian religion. My resolution is to live and die in the religion, ways, and customs of my ancestors. The sole favor I ask of you is to let me keep the necklace and cutlass I am wearing. I shall keep them for love of you. Immediately, without awaiting Van der Stel's reply, he escaped by running away, and he was never seen again at the Cape. This is the subject of the frontispiece. Okay, so here's the frontispiece. Now we can hone in on it a little bit. Okay, so we have the fort in the background. Here's the savage. Okay, and here are the Europeans. Europeans are always in a group, okay, because they depend on each other. The savage is free and independent. There's the bundle of clothes, okay, and he's pointing towards his equals. He returns to his equals, the caption says. The Europeans are decadent. See, that's indicated here by, this is apparently Van der Stel. He's seated, sign of his weakness, his feebleness. Here's the cutlass. Here's the necklace. Here are the hats of the Europeans. And notice this little person looking out, not looking at the scene. He's looking away. These people all have these quizzical remarks. He's looking somewhere else. Okay, now this was the first edition of Rousseau's Second Discourse. Because of copyright problems, they couldn't reprint this etching, so they made a new one, which I actually like better, although it wastes a lot of space here in the clouds. Okay. Now, so here again, we have the savage. So finally, Chisel, is our savage now. The Europeans are again in a group. Van der Stel's feebleness is indicated by his cane, and well, he's put on a few pounds. Okay, here we have the clothes in the bundle again. Clearly, the person who did the second drawing was looking at the first one, second etching. What's new, one new thing over here is a cannon. Okay, so now we have two weapons in the etching, the cutlass and the cannon. Now, if you read these things, I think the point is, well, how many people does it take to manipulate a cutlass? Just one. How many people does it take to run a cannon? Well, a small group. The European weapons is a group project as opposed to the savage who stands on his own 2 feet and fights for himself, fiercely independent. A fence is here. That's new. We remember, of course, Rousseau's famous line that the person who first built a fence around a plot of ground and got other people to believe that it was his was the true originator of civil society. Okay. Now, there are two things that I just, real quick, I want to go over before we conclude. Notice the savage in this picture, and notice the savage here. Okay, number 1, number 2. I sound like the optometrist when you go to get your eyes checked. Which is better? Notice what's profoundly different about 1 versus 2. 1, 2. The savage has his back towards us in the second one. See? Okay, 1, 2. Okay, now that's very strange. why do you draw, to turn around and draw a picture of a person like this is very odd. But of course, I think it's easily explained, okay? Because what do civilized people do that savages don't do? Well, among other things, they read books. The savage isn't just turning away from Vanderbilt, he's turning away from us, we European types who read books. He's turning away from us as well. Then finally, here's this guy again. Okay, he belongs somehow, lives among the Europeans, but he looks away. Since we're getting along in our allotted time, I'll just cut to the chase and say, I think this is Rousseau himself. Okay, he's like the soothsayer in the village soothsayer. He knows about this sad scene of the civilized versus the savage. He knows how that's going to play out. He doesn't really belong anywhere. He certainly can't go live with these people, but he doesn't belong to a nation or a social contract either. Rousseau in the work speaks of great cosmopolitan souls that transcends the artificial boundaries that divide human beings, i.e. philosophers, or maybe romantic artists as well. Okay. All right, now some questions and conclusions. As I was reading back over these this afternoon, that second one is the one I would probably begin with. So if we know anything from Plato's Republic, we know that city and soul are somehow harmonious. They correspond somehow to each other. The state of our soul is reflected in the state of our city, our polis. The state of our city is likewise reflected in the state of our soul. Okay, so, well, let's see. That Hobbes had made the same point, kind of, and Bellarmine certainly accepted this point. If temporal and spiritual affairs are to be separated, it would seem there's going to be an enormous tension within the Christian soul. Okay. Rousseau, the project of Rousseau and Hobbes is to overcome that tension. Right? Now, of course, if Christianity is true, then you deal with the tension. You work out your salvation in fear and trembling, and you don't expect a unified soul, at least in this life. Right? But Hobbes and Rousseau are obviously not Christians. Okay, and they want to get rid of Christianity because of this distinction between the temporal and the spiritual. Restore things to a unity. Chillax is the motto. Okay, don't be so uptight. Just relax and chill out. And now, but then, well, okay, do we really want a sleepy politics where nothing ever happens? Colin and Colette are going to live just like their parents, and their children are going to live just like they did, and their grandchildren are going to live. Nothing's going to change in the French countryside where they live. I mean, that's the problem that it seems that we're presented with here. Which do we want, and which must we pursue? Finally, I just kind of pose this. Christians more and more want to get involved in politics, I guess. Some of them do. All right, well, are we going how should I put this? If we get involved, are we going to create tensions, more disturbances than are presently underway anyhow? Or, is there some way to contribute without filling all of our fellow citizens with angst? Okay, I think we'll stop there, and questions are in order. Okay, thank you.
Kries, I'll let you take your own questions, but I am going to turn the camera on, so
Okay,
on the recording, we'll be able to see you instead of just looking at your last slide.
okay.
So, questions, comments, anyone?
Please.
In the images of the two savages turning away from civilization, the first one, the first chap, looks, poses a less noble figure than the second chap. The second one has a sort of almost Greek ideal looks in excellent shape. He's been at the fitness center regularly and healthier looking. And that seems more in fitting with Rousseau's ideal of country life as healthier for us human beings. But also, if it's out of the Greek model, the Greeks favored reason and science, which would seem to pose a challenge to Rousseau. So that was one thing that I was thinking about with these two very different images of the savage. Very different stories in those two images. Does that make any sense?
It's a good question, sure, and I follow you. I don't think Rousseau wants anything Greek. And so we don't, so, you know, that interpretation of the second etching is, I think, kind of precluded by the subject matter of the essay. But I certainly grant you that it looks more buff, does the savage. The second. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Please.
I was thinking about your treatment of Hobbes. And Hobbes wrote the Leviathan of 1651.
Yes.
And Charles I had his head whacked off in 1649, right?
Yes.
And I ungraciously checked my phone to see when Oliver Cromwell come on the scene. But that was 2 years later, apparently with some sort of intro non-king business. So what do you make? I mean, Hobbes felt at risk, didn't he, with that kind of protectorate with Cromwell and that whole bunch. I mean, he felt personally threatened that he was going to get a guy like Cromwell do something to him if he get his hands on it.
So what should we make of this? Is your question?
Well, I guess the Leviathan, to me, it always has to be understood in the context of the complete collapse of the civil order in England.
Sure. So I would put it this way. It seems to be Hobbes's interpretation of the history of England in the 17th century, that the whole problem was the bloody Christians, okay, with their interest in kingdoms that are not of this world, in another life. And they would use these that interest in these supernatural realities to undermine what was best and what was most important in the here and now, which is peace. Okay, is Hobbes's concern. And you know, if you let Christians into politics, there will be squabbles, and then the squabbles will grow. There will always be tensions, because they judge everything in light of the highest, and nothing measures up ever for the Christians. Okay? So his tact was to reinterpret Christianity. Now he goes after Bellarmine. Bellarmine is the name. Well, why? I think this fits well with your interpretation. Why Bellarmine? And after all, he wasn't even the most extreme of people who wanted religion to have some authority in temporal affairs. There were people, Bellarmine's book was almost placed on the index by the Pope. It was only because the Pope died at the last minute that Bellarmine didn't find himself. The Pope wanted direct control over temporal affairs. Hobbes doesn't go after them, he goes after Bellarmine. Okay. Well, why is that? You know, he despised Cromwell. too, did Hobbes, but he doesn't go after Cromwell, go after Bellarmine. In England in the 17th century, it was always fine and popular to criticize the Catholic, okay, and particularly the Jesuits. Okay, so Campion Hall is named after a Jesuit martyr of England in this time period. Okay, and so you don't talk about that. Bellarmine is your stalking force. Okay, Bellarmine is the one you can criticize. But the principles for criticizing Bellarmine, Hobbes clearly sees can also be used to criticize Cromwell and the other revolutionaries.
But all that business about excommunication, all that had nothing to do with Cromwell.
Well, I mean, that's the extreme. What does excommunication do in this political context? It renders a politician unfit for service in the eyes of the church. Okay, that's its political function. Right? Well, okay, so people weren't actually formally excommunicated, these Christians who would be rulers, but the ones that fell out of favor, they were executed or placed in jail or something like that. And the Christians were happy to be the ones placing others in jail as well. So, I think, so Hobbes works at the level of principles, even while he talks at the level of things that are happening right around him. That would be my interpretation of Hobbes. Sure.
The front piece where the ecclesial authorities on the right-hand side and the secular on the left. And the secular is very militarized, castles, cannons, etc. So I have at home in the office a history of the English Parliament, and on the front piece is a reproduction of some medieval drawing of the king. I believe it's the conqueror, I recall right, William, and his council, which are the predecessors. And there are the bishops and the leading earls and barons of the realm. And the author of history quotes Major Brockton, who wrote this commentary on the law, saying about the monarch, and he who has a colleague has a master. In other words, it's a very moderate image of the conciliatory image of the king rules in and with the church. And each has a role somewhat overlapping to be conciliated, debated, and the council, and the king is not an absolute monarch because he relies and is expected to rely on the council of the leading figures of the realm, secular and ecclesial. So in that image, there's a harmony. And in Hobbes, it's sort of the secular authority is so militarized in that image that he's depicting innate and dangerous conflict. So he's picturing something that's very much against the idea of Christendom.
Well, except for your last point, I was agreeing when you drew that conclusion. So, what is the Christian view of human nature? Well, one interpretation of it is that human beings are marked profoundly by the effects of sin.
Sure.
By the effects of sin, they are marked profoundly. And they behave that way when the cops have their backs turned. Okay. And you can, so, I mean, in that sense, the Christians and Hobbes might share a very low estimate of human nature. But, of course, Christians think that we can become holy. Hobbes seems to think that you always need the authority of the sovereign to frighten people into accepting chaining their passions so that they don't hurt each other. Okay, so even in that, the image that we had of the sovereign, he's built out of all of these people, but into this very kind of scary and mighty figure who frightens the citizens into, leaving other people's property alone and not enslaving others and not killing. Their passions have to be chained by some authority, and he wants that to be the sovereign.
I don't recall, did Hobbes know Aquinas?
He knew Bellarmine, and so some Aquinas through Bellarmine.
Because my point there is Aquinas really has, against that doom and gloom that human nature is fundamentally scarred and actually will abuse one another all the time. Aquinas says the harm due to the fall is not quite that abstract. We can
That's right.
cooperate with grace
Right.
in this fight and do, and we can create institutions that help us do so.
Yeah.
So Hobbes is taking a particular theological view of the fall,
Yeah.
and not the universal.
Well,
That's what
he certainly has a low estimation of human nature.
Well,
I'll
and,
grant you that.
and yes, that's true, but it's not the only Christian interpretation of human nature. And I think that's always struck me in Hobbes is he's got a view that's very vicious about us is not us, but the other 7 billion. And he goes with it. But he doesn't, in my recollection, he doesn't really engage seriously with other, also very sound Christian interpretations, like
Well, I'm sure that's possible. I think probably I'd connect that to your question. Hobbes had seen what happens when political authority breaks down. Okay, and that's what human beings are like. Hobbes have their back turns. When there's a decline of political authority, we're at each other's throats. The state of nature is famously nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, because of human nature, of what we are.
Don't you think they worked through this in England? Though? I mean, you had the Thomas, Richard Hooker, right?
Yeah.
Bishop Hooker wrote 100 years before Hobbes, and he was thorough, right? And John Locke incorporates Hooker by reference in Second Treatise on Government.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he refers back to
Yeah.
to Hooker. And so Hobbes or Locke has a much more benign view of human relationships. Right?
Well, I mean, this is an argument. I certainly grant, and we should know that Hobbes was not popular in England. Okay, he was much more popular on the continent, and so they were interested in his Latin books rather than Leviathan, for the most part. Locke, how's that put it? So I'm one of those Straussians who has interprets Locke along Hobbes and Locke. But that's another subject, how we should understand Locke. Certainly, I grant that on the surface, Locke seems more benign. But, well, when he talks about the state of nature, the very next chapter is of the state of war. So I'm not so sure if in the end Locke's much different than Hobbes. But go ahead.
What he said, Locke said, the state of nature is a state of peace and basically goodwill, people all working together. That's from the Second Treatise. But if you go back to your original, I was very interested in your original slides.
Yeah.
Talking about the law. Acts, I think there was a couple of New Testament things were a little hard to reconcile.
Yeah.
But if you look at Aquinas, and the reason I was thinking about this is because Socrates was a Thomas. He would have said that law is only legitimate if it promotes human flourishing.
Yeah.
So in other words, you can only, if you're a king, you can only claim that authority from God if you're doing the right stuff, right? If
Right.
you're a bad person, then you're a tyrant, all of that. And
So Hobbes is not, he's not a Christian. He doesn't, he works from the base side. He lowers the sights and we'll take our bearings from there. His theory of law is voluntaristic. It's whatever the most powerful person says it is. Okay, and it's not open to any judgment at the court of any higher entity. Okay, it's the king says it, and the king can enforce it, or the sovereign. The sovereign isn't necessarily a king. The sovereign proclaims it and has the power, and hence the authority to enforce it. That's what makes it law. Thomas's more noble estimation of law in terms of what's reasonable, what promotes the common good, and so forth. I mean, that Hobbes couldn't be any farther away.
but doesn't that go to your final questions? Does the Christian involve himself in the political system?
Yeah.
And Thomas's answer would be yes.
Yes. And most of the Christians would say that. You do what you can. Okay, I remember the Psalm, or Jeremiah's words to the exiles. Pray for the nation where you dwell now and do what you can to promote its welfare. Okay, that kind of seems to be the Christian conclusion. But it sometimes seems that when Christians try to engage politically, they're surprised at the antipathy that they receive. And we can say, well, the others are just bigoted or prejudiced or something like that. Thinking about Hobbes and Rousseau, okay, makes you think that, well, maybe their concerns are deeper than that. And maybe that's why Christians encounter difficulties when they try to do these things. It seems to me that we should think about that. That is a challenge to us as we go forward. But I wonder if the young people here, the students, might have questions. Okay, you're thinking. All right. In the meantime, did you want to come back? Or should I go? We got a question over here.
Let me just, and then I'll shut up.
Oh, no, not at all.
I'm trying to think who's the guy's name's Mark something. And he says if you present an argument, present it through logic and natural law, not through creed.
Right.
Because what people get upset about is say we Catholics think this, or we Jehovah's Witnesses think that. But if you talk about law through kind of a natural, what your logic can reach without creed, people are much more willing to listen to.
Yeah. So,
And consider the Catholic moral theology is natural law based, then you can go through those sort of natural Aristotelian virtue kind of approach.
but appeals to reason, including appeals to natural law, I don't know how to put this. They rarely convince anyone who's not Catholic. Okay, and I think Hobbes would say we shouldn't be surprised, okay, because human beings are these passionate, selfish things, and they're much more worried about their passions than they are their thoughts. Remember, reason is a scout and a spy for the passions, and it goes abroad and it looks out for what may be appropriate. Remember that quote from Hobbes. The natural law advocates have a lot of faith in the ability of reason to solve political problems. Okay? Now, the trouble is it assumes that political actors are essentially rational, okay, which is a big assumption. It seems to me, anyway. And that's what Hobbes did. And I think, I guess that's why I'm interested in what these people have to say. I think Hobbes and Rousseau are two of the most mistaken people who ever lived. But you got to think about their points. Okay. Joan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, this is great, thanks. I was thinking about the image of the famous Hobbes image of all the people making up the body. And I'm curious about sort of, what kind of critique, came back at Hobbes from the church. And I think because the thing about the artist was so interesting, the artist that this, united all of the bodies into the one image. Because you see that in religious imagery, various ways. The
We're all
body
one
of Christ
body.
is sometimes depicted that way, and all of them make up the one body. And I can imagine people kind of look at that image and get nervous, like there's replacement happening, like the church is being shifted to the state, and now the state is the site of this sort of mystical unity of all people instead of a church. So I'm just kind of curious about, what is that kind of response that would be to that?
Well, from what you said at first, I thought you were asking about the response in the 17th century, which Hobbes had almost no friends. Okay, I don't know how else to put it. And when the Catholics didn't read him, didn't take him that seriously, frankly. I think the Catholics did. They're concerned with other things. But even the Anglican bishops didn't want anything to do with it. And neither did the monarch. They found him troublesome and lawless. We were kind of wedded to both the Catholics and the Anglicans, this distinction between religion and politics. And then, but the fight was always over who got to appoint the bishop, okay, who had temporal authority and spiritual authority, and each side wanted to control it. It's the same argument in China today, right? It's all a fight about who gets to appoint bishops, so we Americans tend to be committed to this idea of separation. Okay, we just, religion on Sunday and this on these other days, and just keep them apart. And then there can't be any fight. And of course, that means that religion is relegated to an unimportant condition, which religious people aren't. That's what's most important for them. And it's very hard for us to accept that what we consider to be most important is irrelevant in the minds of most of our fellow citizens, or many of them. That's a hard notion to accept. Okay? Hobbes and Rousseau want that reunification. So they don't want the death of religion. They just want the sovereign to be able to control it. And the sovereign will then make sure that the doctrines are the kinds of things that promote what he or she wants promoted. And so it's a manipulation. I would say it's a manipulation of religion, but he would probably respond, yes, but it's in the best interests of the citizens to have their beliefs controlled in this way.
There's a practical fight over it. Not everybody kind of wants their own political stake in the issue.
Sure.
Bishop. I guess I'm curious about the sort of, what would the kind of sincere Christian critique be from someone who isn't, sort of angling for their position in that situation. And, there's like the term that keeps coming to me is William T. Kavanaugh, Catholicism, talks about the migration of the holy.
Uh-huh.
At some point in the development of the modern world, there's a migration of the holy from the church to the state. And the nation state, he says, takes on this kind of new sort of spiritual sense of, people start saluting flags and so on. And they say they're not being religious, but there is a sort of religion around the state, around nationalism. So I'm wondering, like, would it be fair to see Hobbes as part of doing that? We're paving the way for that. Because that image to me is just so striking, the sort of spiritual unity through the sovereign.
Well, I think, so to answer your last question first, yes, that this is what Hobbes is for. He doesn't want religion and politics to be fighting anymore, or religion and temporal authority to be fighting. He wants it to unify, because that will unify not the individual soul, it will unify the factions of the city, and will live at least peaceful. Okay, it might not be a very high and noble life, but it will at least be peaceful. It will at least be able to keep ourselves alive. Okay, the fundamental right is the right of self-preservation. We'll be able to secure that in that situation. Now, the only thing I wonder about, Joan, is this book that you were talking about, The Migration of the Holy in Modern Times. Because I think Hobbes, of course, remember, is a great classicist. And I mean, in Athens, Athena owned the city. The gods and the human beings lived together. And this idea of a politics that's only worried about temporal things. I mean, the politicians, what politician wants to give away everything that's high and noble to the church? So the government is just about, getting the garbage collected and filling in the potholes. Okay, I mean, that lower role of government, it didn't correspond with antiquity either. Okay, so Christianity, remember Fustel de Coulanges is the book, it talks about how Christianity split the unity of the ancient city and destroyed it in favor of a new kind of political arrangement. The church as distinct from temporal authority. Did you think of your questions?
I have a question, but I don't know this before. It has to do with the interpretation of the second sentence, in terms of like we see his factories running away from what's new. One's a factual question that should be quick to answer, and then the second is like you said, cutting this short, and then said that interpretation. But I was wondering about the reason for that interpretation, given the stories that the image was derived from.
Okay.
So, like, one, what was that story? Just so I can write it down and look into it. But then two, why would the savage be running away from, like, learning, I guess, or that type of reading?
Okay, so the first part is this is a story that was reported by a traveler named Colbane that he had seen. It was, he reported it and actually published it, I think, and then it was republished in a collection of historical voyages. It was published in French, multi-volumes. You had all these people going out to investigate the New World and all of these Europeans voyaging everywhere. And they brought back these stories. They were collected in this book called The History of Voyages. And Rousseau read this story there and then quoted it in his footnote. Now, your first point, why does the savage run away from reading? Okay, so Rousseau's argument is that by nature, we are sentimental beings rather than rational beings. Reason is a contrived thing. It's something we've acquired as we've entered civil society. So sort of think of a chicken, okay? Once upon a time, a chicken by nature could get along in nature. Okay, it must survive. But as it becomes controlled by civilized people, we've turned a chicken into, a chicken couldn't last 10 minutes in the wild today. Okay, they're the dumbest things. Okay, well, we've kind of done that to ourselves. Rousseau says we were once these great beasts who could survive in nature just fine on our own. Okay, and but we've made ourselves dependent on each other, and that makes us as a species weaker and weaker and more feeble. Okay, part of the way we have done that is by inventing reason to deal with our problem. Once you had to take a horse everywhere, and before that you had to walk or swim or whatever. Now we have automobiles, okay, and we're wimpy and flabby and out of shape, and we've changed our whole bodies. Okay, Rousseau suggests it's an evolutionary thesis. Only we're changing ourselves for the worse rather than the better. Okay, so this fascination with the earlier condition is part and parcel of Rousseau. Well, books are about sitting and thinking and not doing and making and fighting and the kinds of things that are by nature. Okay, and hence they corrupt us, see, is Rousseau's point. Now, okay, this may explain everyone but Rousseau. Okay, so what does he do? Well, he says he can't go back to nature. The civilized cannot go back and live among tribal peoples. We don't have the skills, we don't have the physical prowess to do it. Okay, so what does he do? He tries to resuscitate in his heart those original sentiments of compassion that would have been present earlier in the human species. We're a little, it's Vincent van Gogh. In the popular consciousness, he was way beyond us. We couldn't understand him. We normal types who belong to a social contract, we couldn't get it, and so he couldn't really live. The romantic artist always exists on the fringes of society. Okay, or the poet, the romantic poet, uncovers these well springs of pity and tries to bring them forth. But we citizen types, we really don't understand poets. Okay, they're beyond us and above us, doing something else. Well, that's what Rousseau thought of himself. He's being one of those cosmopolitan souls, never really understood by society, never at home anywhere, okay? But with affection in his heart for all mankind.
So then that comes to a second question regarding the discussion of human nature for Rousseau. What
Yeah.
would humans be like? Would he have a positive outlook on human nature?
In this sense, okay, so he does not believe in original sin or anything like that. By nature, we are not dependent upon each other, but by nature, we would not have hurt each other either. Okay, we would simply have been independent, pursued our own good without harming others. Okay, unless we were trying to catch the same deer or rabbit or something like that, then there might have been a squabble. Okay, so we were fundamentally good at the beginning. Civilization is the story of how we have corrupted ourselves. Civilization is the original sin that's made us worse and worse, and as we've gone forward, makes us seek honor, and the French word is amour propre. In civilization, we have to live in the eyes of others. We have to care about what others think about us. Okay, I've got to impress you, got to impress me. After all, I'm going to give you a grade, say, if I'm your teacher. And we're constantly competing with each other in civil society. And then this gives rise to all kinds of ignoble passions, envy and greed and spite and contempt and love of honor and all of these sorts of things that human beings would not have felt, he thinks, in the state of nature. The original human, so Rousseau asks in that second discourse, he reports on some sightings of, he calls them pongos, they're gorillas, of orangutans, he calls them, and the primates. And he hypothesizes, he's never seen one of these, okay? And you know more about primates from a visit to the zoo than he was ever able to gather. He said he had seen a chimpanzee once that somebody had brought back in captivity. But he asked the question whether the gorilla is actually a human being that has not left the state of nature. Okay, so it's not Darwinian. Did the gorilla turn into a human being? No. Is the gorilla actually from which or out of which we have degenerated into our present condition? Now, he doesn't say, he says you'd have to have experiments to find that out. He doesn't know. But, he proposes delicately crossbreeding experiments to see if fertile offspring could be produced. That would settle the question. Okay, now we know gorillas aren't human beings, but do you see, what a question to ask. Is that a human being rather than what we are? David, it's
Yeah, we're out of time.
7.
I was just wondering, I wish I had time for a question, and I'll ask it anyway, or at least I'll throw it out. In connection with this last comment you're making, it seems like it's quite interesting. We can think of Hobbes is claiming that politics is salvation. Rousseau says that politics is our civilization anyway, is our corruption.
Yeah.
And there's an important sense in which Christianity, if you think of Bellarmine as a representative figure here, would say it's neither of those, right? Is that correct? Because we don't
certainly
find
it's not
salvation
politics.
in politics.
No.
But politics is not our real problem either, right? Sin is our real problem.
Sure. The only thing is that then the Christian thinker is going to take us one step further. What political means would be at our disposal to reduce sin or to control sin or channel sin? Okay, and then we're bound up with political realities at that point. Yeah. I could talk some more about Hobbes and Rousseau.
We are a bit over. Hey, thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad that you braved the post-COVID context and we're here in person. We do have other events planned for the Socratic, including some related to Gonzaga's philosophy of human nature core curriculum course that are coming up in October, November. The plans are still fluid, or I would say more, but we'll have to leave it at that. Thanks again for coming. Have a great evening.
Okay.
Thank you.